Hi again. Welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we looked at how Christian IV of Denmark used his many children to secure his grip over the country in his struggle with the nobility. We also saw how his sons and sons-in-law with various women undermined much of the king's work by fighting with each other and with him. Today, we'll have a look at another arguably dysfunctional royal family, namely the one in Sweden. Episode 94, Dowager Drama. I'm sure you remember that when Gustavus Adolphus fell in the Battle of Lutzen in episode 89, Sweden was thrown into a bit of a crisis. The charismatic king was dead and the only heir was a 6-year-old girl. The enthusiasm for a woman on the throne was limited, but the only living male with a reasonably good claim to the throne was the King of Poland, a Catholic. In the end, anti-Catholicism won over misogyny and Christina was confirmed as queen. But since she was only a child, a regency government was set up to rule in her place until she turned 18. As I've mentioned already, the man tasked with leading the regency government was none other than our old friend Axel Oxenstierna. The man who had been Gustavus Adolphus's right-hand man was 49 years old when he was given this role. It wasn't the easiest thing to do, and he spent a lot of time on the continent, managing the war in the Holy Roman Empire. But he had several thorny issues to deal with also at home. One of his, and the regency government's, many headaches was the Dowager Queen, Maria Eleonora. Gustavus Adolphus's widow was from the Protestant Principality of Brandenburg in the Holy Roman Empire. As I mentioned last time, she was the niece of Queen Anne Catherine of Denmark, Christian IV's first wife. She married Gustavus Adolphus in 1620. Even though their union had been a political agreement, as royal marriages traditionally were, it seems they were actually happy together. Based on her letters and surviving testimonies, Maria Eleonora loved her husband intensely. Some have even suggested she loved him too much. Even though she adored Gustavus Adolphus, Maria Eleonora wasn't impressed by Sweden. She'd been brought up in Berlin, a bustling city of culture and commerce that put Stockholm to shame. Even though Swedish noblemen were busy transforming the city that recently had been elevated to the status of official capital of Sweden by building magnificent palaces and other institutions with the money they'd pillaged on the continent and stuffing their new splendid homes with artwork and furniture they'd stolen when raiding castles and monasteries, it was still not an impressive place. Definitely not compared to other capitals of major European powers. Maria Eleonora did what she could to improve things. She was a generous patron of the arts and spent large sums on artists, musicians, and artisans. She was the first Swedish queen to really take on this role, which had been common for queens to do on the continent for generations already. The development of Swedish painting and music in the 17th and 18th centuries has a lot to thank her for. But her greatest passion was the theatre. To be frank, Swedish theatre was abysmal before her arrival. As a part of the wedding festivities, she was treated to a play performed by students from Uppsala University, and as soon as she could, she set about improving things. She supported talented actors, the translation of plays, and the writing of original works in Swedish. She instilled this and all other cultural interests in her daughter Christina, who tends to get most of the credit for the Swedish cultural boost in the 17th century, even though she was building on what her mother had started. Being a patron of the arts is all well and good, but 17th century queens really had one essential task: providing a male heir. Through his extramarital activities, Gustavus Adolphus had already proven that he was capable of producing healthy male offspring, so from the start, the burden of proof was on Maria Eleonora. She did become pregnant almost immediately after the wedding, but in 1621 she sadly gave birth to a stillborn girl. 2 years later, in 1623, another girl was born, but she only lived for a year or so before she also died. Both times, the king received the tragic news about his dead daughters while he was abroad fighting some war, but he always returned to Sweden to impregnate Maria Eleonora again. Already in 1624, she gave birth to another child. This time it was a boy, but unfortunately, he was also stillborn. It couldn't have been easy to be Maria Eleonora. One can only imagine the heartbreak mixed with the mounting pressure of proving she was capable of fulfilling the one task everyone expected her to. In 1626, another child was finally born. While she was pregnant, Maria Eleonora had dreamt that this time it would finally be a boy, and when the baby was born, it was so hairy and screamed so loud that at first everyone thought it really was. But then they soon discovered their mistake. It was another girl. According to the autobiography of that girl, Christina, named after her paternal grandmother, the disappointed Maria Eleonora started to cry hysterically when she realized she'd given birth to yet another girl, and such an ugly one at that. But Gustavus Adolphus was supposedly thrilled, stating that the baby was as good as any boy. This vignette should, of course, be taken with a grain of salt. It was written long after the fact by someone who technically was present at the time, but who hardly could have remembered any of it, and who had spent a life lionizing her father, and whose relationship with her mother would become more than a little strained. Even though the king was supposed to have been pleased with Christina's birth, he hadn't given up hope on having a son. But to be on the safe side, after all, the Polish Vasas were still out there lurking in the background, claiming they should rightfully sit on the Swedish throne, Gustavus Adolphus had the Riksdag recognize Christina as the heir presumptive. That meant she'd succeed him unless the queen would eventually manage to give birth to a boy. In the meantime, the king treated Christina as if she'd actually been a son. The celebrations at court to mark her birth followed the protocol of the birth of a prince, not a princess, and he ordered that she'd be given the upbringing of a boy, meaning she'd learn politics, history, philosophy, theology, fencing, riding, and all sorts of things young women weren't usually taught. Two men were given the important task of handling Christina's education. One was a bishop called Johannes Mattias, which probably had been Johann Mattsson before he went to university. In English, I guess his name would be John Matthews, so let's go with that. The second was none other than Axel Oxenstierna, because he obviously didn't have anything else to do. Soon after having settled the issue of the succession and Christina's education, Gustavus Adolphus went off to the Holy Roman Empire to play the role of the Lion from the North. All this fighting abroad reduced the possibility of producing an heir, but it didn't mean that the king and queen never met. Gustavus Adolphus would go to Sweden in the winters to see his wife, and Maria Eleonora wanted to go to Germany and be with her husband during the campaigns. Already in 1627, she started to write letters to the king, begging to be allowed to join him on the continent. Maria Eleonora complained that she longed for him so intensely that she couldn't eat or sleep. That's perhaps a little much, but it was the literary convention of the time. People in the 1600s didn't shy away from emotions, and dramatic flair was usually seen not only as normal, but even a sign of good taste. Even men would cry in public to express how intensely they felt about various things. Gustavus Adolphus also wanted Maria Eleonora to join him. As you may remember from previous episodes, he had this wild idea of supplanting the emperor in Vienna and to create a new, powerful Protestant empire in Europe with himself at the helm. For that, he needed his queen by his side to show the German Protestants what a great couple they were. The only problem was that it would be expensive to bring Maria Eleonora to him, because a regular traveling party wouldn't do. This was the Queen of Sweden, the wife of the Lion from the North, who was coming. As the historian Peter England put it, in the 17th century, power wasn't power unless it looked like power. If you wanted people to take you seriously, you had to look the part. If the queen were to travel, she needed to travel in style. And since the government couldn't afford it, Maria Eleonora had to stay put in Sweden for the time being. It was only in 1631, when the French money started to flow, that Maria Eleonora could finally be kitted out to travel to the Holy Roman Empire to be with her husband. As soon as all the arrangements had been made, she set off with an enormous entourage. The young Christina was left in the care of her aunt, Catherine Vasa. In late December 1631, Maria Eleonora made her festive entry into Frankfurt am Main, where she finally met her husband, the war hero. He arranged a grand ceremony with some kind of pseudo-coronation, where the queen was presented with a splendid diadem. The new headgear may have been splendid, but as it would turn out later, it hadn't actually been paid for. But it looked good at the ceremony, and that's all that mattered at the time. The queen's arrival, the meeting with the king, the business with the diadem, it was all part of Gustavus Adolphus's propaganda efforts to show the Germans that he was a worthy leader of this future Protestant empire. The king and queen spent the winter together, but in spring of 1632 he set off to war again, leaving her behind. Gustavus Adolphus didn't want his wife to come too close to the actual fighting, and he also wanted her to pass as little time as possible in regions ravaged by the war. Still, their paths crossed several times in 1632, and they even spent the late summer and early fall together. Gustavus Adolphus and Maria Eleonora parted ways in late October, when he went on to Lützen, where he was killed in the battle on November 6th. When she heard the news about her husband's death, Maria Eleonora was devastated. She loved him, sure, but she had lost so much more than her husband. When he was alive, she had an elevated position at the center of political life in Sweden. Now, her situation was much more precarious. She was the Dowager Queen, a has-been, in a foreign country where she didn't have many friends or allies. A new generation would take over, and she would be pushed to the sidelines. To make matters worse, she was stuck on the continent with her husband's embalmed body, waiting for the funds to transport him back to Sweden, because it wasn't much cheaper to move a dead king than it was to transport a living queen. So Maria Eleonora had no choice but to wait. As was the fashion at the time, she had Gustavus Adolphus's heart embalmed separately and placed in a little box. This box she carried around at all times. She spent most of her days by her dead husband's coffin, clutching the box containing his heart on her lap. She was 33 years old. Her future looked bleak. Historians have characterized Maria Eleonora as vain, jealous, stupid, extravagant, weak, irresponsible, capricious, hysterical, even unhinged, but beautiful. This image of the Dowager Queen was set not least by her own daughter, Queen Christina, who gave a far from flattering portrait of her mother in that autobiography I mentioned earlier. 19th century historians latched onto the description of the hysterical beauty, but later generations have tried to rehabilitate Maria Eleonora's honor by trying to analyze her behavior after the king's death from her perspective. When you do, it makes a little more sense, but it's still pretty extravagant. Even though Axel Oxenstierna hasn't left quite such a damning description of Maria Eleonora as her daughter did, it's still clear that he didn't trust the Dowager Queen. He and the majority of the Regency government thought her unreliable, still identifying with her native Brandenburg, possibly pro-Danish and even anti-Swedish. Oxenstierna and the other members of the government weren't necessarily wrong, but they were also partly to blame for the Queen's frosty attitude toward her new homeland. When the Regency was established, Maria Eleonora was still in Germany with the body of her dead husband, waiting to return to Sweden. When she learned that she had been excluded from the government, she flew into a rage. In Swedish tradition, Dowager Queens had traditionally been given seats on the Regency governments for their underage children. But Axel Oxenstierna had convinced the other members of the Council of the Realm that it would be best for everyone involved, and especially for Sweden, if Maria Eleonora was excluded. When Maria Eleonora and the body of Gustavus Adolphus eventually made their way back to Sweden, Axel Oxenstierna and the others hoped that the Dowager Queen would accept her new role as a non-entity in the margins of royal circles. They were mistaken. The retinue from Germany disembarked at Nyköping, about 100 kilometers southwest of Stockholm. There, Maria Eleonora more or less barricaded herself with her husband's corpse in her apartment at Nyköping Castle. She had the walls and even the windows draped in heavy black fabric. The darkened rooms were lit with wax candles, even in the daytime. Maria Eleonora was constantly crying, often caressing the increasingly decomposing body in the open coffin. In her autobiography, Christina described how uncomfortable she was whenever she had to visit her mother's gloomy apartment. Now, when the body was back in Sweden, the Regency government wanted to get Gustavus Adolphus buried as soon as possible. It was important for Christina's and their legitimacy. Christina would be confirmed as queen, with them as the regency government, at a Riksdag held on the occasion of the funeral. Until that was done, the issue of the succession wasn't properly settled. But Maria Eleonora refused. She let Axel Oxenstierna know that she wouldn't part with her beloved husband. He would remain with her, unburied, as long as she was alive. The regency government was appalled. The Dowager Queen had clearly lost her mind. This was disrespectful to the hero king, not to mention heresy. But, perhaps more importantly, it also presented a political problem. Their legitimacy was in danger as long as Gustavus Adolphus wasn't buried and Christina's and their status hadn't been confirmed by a Riksdag. Maria Eleonora knew this just as well as they did. So maybe she hadn't taken leave of her senses. Maybe she was playing a game of high politics with them. They had excluded her from the regency government, so now she was going to undermine them, unless, of course, she was let in. The struggle went on for months, but in the end, Maria Eleonora had to relent. She had no allies in Sweden, and her opponents held all the cards. In the end, she had to agree to a funeral. In June 1634, the body of Gustavus Adolphus finally returned to Stockholm and was buried in the church known today as Riddarholmskyrkan. The fallen line from the north received a funeral that was as grand as could be, but still, no foreign dignitaries were invited. After having spent a few years on the continent, members of the Swedish government were too self-conscious, even embarrassed by Stockholm. They thought the kingdom's prestige would suffer if too many high-ranking foreigners actually saw the capital of the budding Swedish Empire. Once again, power wasn't power if it didn't look like power, and Stockholm 1634 definitely didn't look the part it was supposed to play. If the regency government thought that they'd be able to forget about the annoying Dowager Queen now that Gustavus Adolphus was finally safely underground, they were mistaken again. Not long after the funeral, Maria Eleonora petitioned to be allowed to visit the grave. And I don't mean the gravesite in the church, but actually open the grave and enter it. Some of the members of the government were open to the idea, but when she asked to be allowed to open the coffin and caress the body, as she'd grown accustomed to while she was holding up the funeral, they balked. Even though they forbade it, Maria Eleonora tried to sneak down into her husband's crypt. In the end, Axel Oxenstierna placed guards at the grave and ordered that anyone who helped the Dowager Queen open the lid of the coffin would be executed. But even after that intermezzo was behind them, the quarreling between Maria Eleonora and the regency government continued. They argued over money. The Dowager Queen didn't think she received as much as she was entitled to, and definitely not enough. The government retorted that if she wasn't so wasteful, she'd see that she had more than enough money. In light of all this drama and conflict, the government started to worry that Maria Eleonora was a harmful influence on the young Queen Christina. They feared she'd transfer her hatred of Sweden to her daughter. They were probably just as worried, if not more, that the Dowager Queen would transfer her hatred of them to her daughter. In a few short years, Christina would turn 18, and then she'd take over the government herself. If she'd been given the impression that her mother had been treated poorly, the young queen might decide to take revenge on the men responsible for her mother's suffering. The members of the government knew this, and they wanted to do what they could to minimize Christina's exposure to evil slander against them. In 1636, they decided it was time to act, and decided to separate mother and daughter. The young Christina would be placed under the guardianship of someone who could be trusted to instill loyalty and love for Sweden and the regency government in the queen. Based on her memoirs, Christina welcomed the decision. She found her mother clingy, needy, and overly emotional. All these cloying emotions made the young girl uneasy. Christina wanted to focus on the mind, on her education, and felt that her lightweight mom only cared about clothes, etiquette, and entertainment. In her autobiography, she claims she was relieved to be rescued from that world of women, as she put it, a world of subservience, vanity, ignorance, dresses, and gossip. She couldn't stand it. Maria Eleonora was less thrilled, but she couldn't do anything to stop it. When Christina was 9 years old, her mother was forced to leave the royal residence in Stockholm and move to Gripsholm Castle instead. If that name rings a bell, it may be because Gripsholm had featured in several episodes in the past. For example, this was the place Eric XIV kept his brother John prisoner while he figured out if he should execute him and hand his wife over to the Russians. When Maria Eleonora moved out, Christina's aunt, Catherine Vasa, moved into the castle in Stockholm with her children so that Christina would still have a mother figure in her life. One of Catherine's children was a boy called Carl Gustav. This cousin of Christina's will figure prominently in future episodes. When Catherine died 2 years later, in 1638, Maria Eleonora wrote to the government and asked if she couldn't be allowed to move back and provide her daughter with the parental love and care that Catherine had. They replied that Christina no longer required a mother figure in her life. The young queen was 12 years old at the time. Instead of a mother, biological or ersatz, Christina had 2 male role models, her teachers appointed by her father. They had been busy giving her a solid education, and Christina was well versed in politics, history, philosophy, and theology. She also spoke, or at least understood, no fewer than 9 languages. Beyond her mother tongue, which was German, she also spoke Swedish, Danish, French, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, Latin, and Greek. In addition, she had some knowledge of Hebrew and Finnish. The skilled statesman Axel Oxenstierna no doubt taught her many useful things, but it seems like she connected on a more emotional level with her other teacher, the bishop, John Matthews. She even ended up calling him Dad. We'll return to John Matthews and his importance in shaping Christina's worldview next time. Understandably, Maria Eleonora was distraught to have been separated from her daughter. Once again, love and politics coincided. I'm sure she suffered emotionally when she was taken from her only child, but the separation also meant she was robbed of her last chance to influence politics. She was now truly relegated to the margins, practically a prisoner in a provincial castle, out of both sight and mind of everyone who was anyone in Sweden. But Maria Eleonora wasn't going to accept this state of affairs. She declared that if she couldn't be with her daughter, she wouldn't remain in Sweden. She'd move home, back to her native Brandenburg, where they'd treat her with the respect she deserved. She didn't care what anyone thought about it. And back in Stockholm, people were thinking about it. Quite a lot. For the Regency government, it was out of the question that the Dowager Queen leave Sweden and settle abroad. It would have been a huge embarrassment for everyone involved. They forbade her from traveling, and members of the government, even Axel Oxenstierna personally, pleaded with her to forget about the whole idea. They even threatened her. If you go, we will cut you off. There will be no money at all if you choose to leave the country. Maria Eleonora didn't care. She kept planning her escape. She was assisted by none other than the Danish envoy to Stockholm, Peter Wibe, the man who wrote to warn Christian IV about Swedish plans to attack Denmark back in episode 92. Peter Wibe stayed for extended periods of time at Gripsholm as her guest. It's more than likely that King Christian of Denmark actually helped her with her plan to escape. At the very least, he knew about it. In the summer of 1640, Maria Eleonora took the plunge. The whole thing was carefully planned. Well in advance, she had established a routine where she and a maid would lock themselves up in the Dowager Queen's apartment in the castle for 3 days every month for fasting and prayer. So when no one saw Maria Eleonora for 3 days, it didn't raise any particular suspicion. That gave her the time to slip away through a tunnel that had been dug from her rooms under the garden and down to the lake. She was collected by Danish agents and brought to the coast, where a ship waited to carry her away. When the government realized that the Dowager Queen had escaped, they sent out people to chase after her. The problem was that no one knew where she had gone, and by the time they figured it out, she was already on Gotland. The island was still in Danish hands at the time, since it would only be returned to Sweden in another few years after the Torstensson War. In Visby, she was greeted by the locals and treated like a celebrity. It was deeply embarrassing to the Regency government that she'd left Sweden, and doubly so that she'd gone to the arch-enemy, Denmark. Christian IV of Denmark relished the ability to embarrass the Swedes, but he didn't want Maria Eleonora to stay in his kingdom. That would almost certainly create an unnecessary diplomatic crisis with Sweden. He wanted her to move on back to Brandenburg as soon as possible. But right about now, a big glaring hole in the plan appeared. The Elector of Brandenburg, Maria Eleonora's nephew, refused to let her in. That meant she was now stuck in Denmark. This made Christian IV rather uncomfortable. He started to send unconvincing messages to Stockholm, declaring that he had no knowledge of anything about Maria Eleonora's plans to escape, and he definitely hadn't helped her in any way whatsoever. At the same time, he packed the Dowager Queen of Sweden off to a provincial castle, out of the way, far from Copenhagen, so that he could keep her at distance. 3 years later, in 1643, the Elector finally relented and agreed to let his aunt Maria Eleonora return to Brandenburg. She first went to Prussia, which belonged to the Elector, and then eventually to Brandenburg proper, where she settled outside Berlin. But Maria Eleonora didn't like it in Brandenburg either, and complained she was treated worse there than she had been in Sweden. About a year after Maria Eleonora returned to Brandenburg, on December 7th, 1644, her daughter Christina came of age. This was a pivotal moment. Would she break free from the men who had dominated her and the Regency government, led by Axel Oxenstierna, or would she continue to obediently follow their advice? Opponents of the ruling clique were hopeful that she would take power and use it. They thought the only thing protecting the people from the tyranny of the nobles was a strong monarch. On the other hand, Axel Oxenstierna and the council were also a little worried. They couldn't be 100% sure vengeance wasn't coming their way. To begin with, Christina treaded carefully, showing she had learned to be a skillful politician. But she did also start to point out a new direction. Her direction. One of the first things she did was to lobby the council to give her mother estates in Swedish-occupied Pomerania in order to support her in a way that a Dowager Queen should be. They resisted her efforts, and when she instead suggested that Maria Eleonora be invited back to Sweden, where all her previous estates and privileges be reinstated, they eventually relented. In 1647, Maria Eleonora was invited back to Sweden. The 48-year-old Dowager Queen took her daughter up on the offer, and a year later, in June 1648, after she had gathered a proper entourage, she returned to the country she had escaped 8 years before. She eventually settled in Nyköping, where she spent her last years enjoying the theatre. Sometimes she'd even go to Stockholm to visit Christina, and it seems like they developed something of resembling a functional relationship in those years, centered on their common love for the arts, and helped by the fact that they lived 100 kilometers apart and couldn't see each other all that frequently. Next time, we'll see what else Queen Christina decided to do now that she was free to decide for herself, and whether the aristocrats who surrounded her had any reason to worry. But before I end this episode, I would like to answer a question, or rather a request I've received on Facebook. A listener called Larry asked why I didn't mention the warship Vasa when I talked about Gustavus Adolphus's wars. The truth is that it slipped my mind. But since it's both a great example of Swedish efforts to beef up its military capacity and an illustration of the king's megalomania, it would be a pity to pass it by in silence. So thank you, Larry, for giving me the second chance to talk about what arguably was the greatest fiasco in Swedish naval history. Gustavus Adolphus ordered the construction of the Vasa, named after his own dynasty, as a part of his efforts to create a fleet that could challenge Denmark for supremacy over the Baltic Sea. Dutch-born shipbuilders were contracted to do the work, since they had the know-how that few Swedes possessed at the time. The king wanted a flagship with unrivaled firepower, so he decided that the Vasa should carry no fewer than 72 24-pound guns. There was no chance one gun deck would fit so many cannons, so they decided to add a second gun deck. This in itself shouldn't have been too much of a problem, as long as the guns on the upper deck would be 12-pounders instead of 24-pounders. The Vasa was actually constructed with gun ports dimensioned for 12-pound cannons on the upper deck, but in the end the larger type of cannon was placed on both decks. This meant that the ship's center of gravity became dangerously high. In other words, the Vasa was top-heavy. This became abundantly clear in the summer of 1628 when the ship's captain carried out a stability test in the presence of Vice Admiral Fleming. They had 30 men run back and forth across the top deck to see how the Vasa would handle the rolling sea. Vice Admiral Fleming had to order the men to stop running after only 3 trips back and forth because the ship was dangerously close to flipping over on her side. Fleming left the shipyard full of dread, but he couldn't stop or postpone the maiden voyage. The king, who was campaigning in Poland at the time, kept writing increasingly impatient letters demanding that the Vasa should be put to sea immediately. So, on August 10th, 1628, the Vasa departed on her maiden voyage from central Stockholm. It was a lovely summer day with a light breeze. Hundreds, if not thousands, of spectators lined the harbour and the city quays to witness this wonder of Swedish naval might sail off to fight the kingdom's enemies overseas. Several ambassadors, envoys and spies sent by those enemies, as well as Sweden's allies, were also in attendance. Almost as soon as she set sail, a gust of wind caught her sails and the Vasa suddenly dipped dangerously to one side. The sailors managed to right her again as the gust passed, but after another few hundred meters, another, slightly stronger gust of wind filled the sails, pushing the ship to her side. This time, the ship tilted so much that water started to pour in through the gun ports on the lower gun deck. The ports were open because the ship was supposed to fire a salute as she left Stockholm. But the Vasa never managed to leave the city. More and more water gushed in, making it impossible to right the ship again. The horrified spectators on land watched as she leaned over more and more until she finally sank, after having sailed for only a few minutes. Even though the Vasa sank only 120 meters from shore, and many boats that were out on the bay to watch the sail away hurried to pick up people from the water, at least 30 people drowned. In those days, a lot of people, even sailors, couldn't swim. Less than a month later, a tribunal consisting of members of the Admiralty and the Council of the Realm held an inquest to figure out what had gone wrong and, more importantly, who was to blame. But in the end, no one could be found to be guilty. The crew had acted exemplary, and the ship had been built to the exact measurements ordered by the king himself. And that was most likely the problem. It would have been impossible to point the finger at the king, so instead, the sinking was declared an act of God. Most of the brand new bronze cannons were salvaged from the Vasa, but after that she eventually fell into obscurity. She rested undisturbed at the bottom of the sea for over 300 years, until the late 1950s, when she was rediscovered. Amazingly, it turned out that the ship was largely intact, and in 1961 the Vasa was salvaged together with thousands of objects, as well as over a dozen bodies. Today, the Vasa has become a unique and very popular tourist attraction in Stockholm. Next time you visit the Swedish capital, you can, no, scratch that, you should, visit the Vasa Museum and have a closer look at the ship itself, some of the artifacts found on board, and learn more about the amazing recovery of the ship, as well as life in 17th century Sweden. With that, I think it's time to sign off. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are also into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal, accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as "Wake up early if you want another man's land or life," "Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies," or "Speak useful words or be silent." Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop, or if you just crave more content, at least vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer Twitter, or X as it's called these days, then you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. Nkman. I look forward to hearing from you.